You think medieval politics was all about kings, castles, and open warfare? Think again. Prepare to uncover the hidden world of medieval diplomacy, where master strategists secretly navigated treacherous political landscapes, revealing sophisticated tactics that kept empires from crumbling and forged the very map of Europe as we know it today. Long before the thunder of hooves on a battlefield or the clang of swords at dawn, there were quieter wars waged. Wars not of steel and fire, but of ink, glances, and whispered intentions. If the medieval world was a chessboard, kings were rarely its most cunning players. The true power often rested with those who never lifted a blade. Diplomats, envoys, negotiators operating in the shadow of the throne, silhouetted figures who understood that alliances could outlive armies, and that a single marriage could conquer more than 1,000 knights ever could. We are taught to imagine the Middle Ages as an age of brute force, of iron-fisted monarchs and ceaseless war. But this story is incomplete. For every bloody siege or crusade, there were 10 silent negotiations, pacts made in candlelit chambers, beneath coats of arms and family banners. In fact, most medieval conflicts were not resolved with battles at all. They were settled through marriage contracts, strategic gifts, mutual hostages, and words carefully chosen over months of correspondence. This was the hidden machinery beneath the surface spectacle of power, a diplomatic order as delicate and dangerous as any battlefield. Imagine a Europe fragmented into dozens of kingdoms, principalities, and duchies, each with its own ambitions, rivalries, and fears. Open war was costly, unpredictable, and often devastating to both victor and vanquished. In this landscape, the diplomat was more valuable than the general. Trained in rhetoric, fluent in multiple tongues, and armed with cultural insight, these figures operated under immense pressure. A single misstep could mean war, exile, or death. But a perfectly timed gesture or phrase could prevent the collapse of dynasties. And so, the age-old weapon of marriage took on strategic power. The union between a king's daughter and his enemy's son was not romance, it was geopolitics. A wedding became a treaty. A child, born of two rival bloodlines, became a living pact. Through these marriages, enemies became kin and long-standing. Hostilities were suspended, at least for a generation. But beneath the surface of unity, suspicion always simmered. The bride might be a hostage in all but name. The dowry might contain not only gold, but land, shifting entire borders in the quiet flick of a quill point. One of the earliest examples of this dark art can be traced to the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne himself, emperor of the Franks, married off his daughters not for love or alliance, but to prevent them from birthing rival bloodlines outside of his control. And when his enemies sought union through marriage, he hesitated, not out of affection, but because he understood that a marriage could be a Trojan horse. Over the centuries, this tactic evolved, becoming more calculated, more ruthless, but diplomacy in the Middle Ages extended far beyond marriage. Gifts, too, became weapons, lavish relics, rare manuscripts, or jeweled objects sent as tokens of goodwill or veiled power. An emerald chalice gifted from one court to another might symbolize respect or subtle dominance. The recipient would need to decode the hidden language behind the gesture. Was it flattery? Tribute? A warning? Then there were envoys, those tasked with carrying messages between courts, often through dangerous and hostile terrain. These individuals risked ambush, disease, or political betrayal with every step. And yet, they were vital. Trusted messengers could bend the course of nations. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, and entire kingdoms could fall into chaos. Consider the journey of Geoffrey of Villehardouin, a chronicler and diplomat during the Fourth Crusade. Though better remembered for his writing, Geoffrey operated as a key negotiator in fraught political terrain, maneuvering between Venice and Constantinople. His actions helped redirect the crusade itself, an entire military campaign altered not by battlefield strategy, but by whispered agreements and uneasy promises. And what of the forgotten missions? The envoys whose names were not preserved in illuminated manuscripts or monastic chronicles. These silent diplomats moved between rival powers like shadows, carrying words more explosive than any siege weapon. They learned to read the subtleties of court life, to adjust their posture to suit foreign customs, to flatter without submission, and to threaten without violence. Their weapons were eyes, ears, and silenced. We now enter the halls of France in the late 14th century, a moment teetering on the edge of war. Tensions with England had reached a boiling point. The Hundred Years' War had raged on and off, a brutal conflict that consumed generations. Yet in 1396, something unusual happened. A truce was proposed, not through surrender, but through marriage. King Richard II of England would wed Isabella of Valois, a child barely 7 years old. The symbolism was unmistakable. A union between two royal bloodlines meant an end, or at least a pause, in the bloodshed, but this was not merely a romantic gesture. Behind the scenes, weeks of intricate negotiation had unfolded. Envoys passed between London and Paris, each armed with coded language, veiled threats, and carefully drafted demands. Terms were negotiated: dowries, succession rights, land exchanges. The marriage was merely the performance. The real victory was won long before the ceremony, over ink, not iron. Elsewhere, in a lesser-known corner of Europe, a single diplomat altered the fate of an entire realm. Niccolò Machiavelli, though more Renaissance than medieval, drew heavily from the diplomatic heritage of earlier centuries. He understood that power could be manipulated without armies, through perception, illusion, and timing. And while Machiavelli codified this thinking, the medieval world had already practiced it for centuries. Diplomacy was not passive. It was a form of calculated aggression, sometimes more dangerous than open war. It demanded psychological insight, historical memory, and mastery of human fear. It was not uncommon for diplomats to use cultural exchanges as pressure points. The loan of a rare book, the commissioning of a mural in another court style. Even food could serve as silent influence. Banquets were ingredients whispered of distant alliances or betrayals. This soft power built webs of influence that extended across generations. It is no coincidence that so many royal houses remained entangled, their family trees resembling more a knot than a lineage. The Habsburgs, the Capetians, the Plantagenets, each mastered the art of marrying power, not people, and all of it, every pact, every smile across a gilded hall, was underwritten by a brutal logic: trust no one, and yet, make them believe you do. Step deeper now into the corridors where diplomacy blurred into deception, where envoys became spies, and courtiers turned into information brokers, weaving a web of secrets beneath the polished veneer of politics. If Part 1 revealed the surface, tools of marriage and pageantry, Part 2 will peel back the velvet curtain to expose a darker, more volatile force at play in medieval diplomacy: subterfuge. For the true diplomat of the Middle Ages was rarely alone. Shadowing his steps was another figure, quieter, perhaps, but more dangerous: the spy. As kingdoms sought leverage over one another, intelligence became currency. The court of a rival monarch was not merely a place of protocol. It was a treasure trove of vulnerabilities, unguarded conversations, rivalries among nobles, whispered dissent from the clergy. A sharp-eyed servant, a bribed minstrel, a lady-in-waiting with a hidden agenda, all were tools in this clandestine art. Consider the Plantagenet court under Henry II. This was not just a monarch renowned for legal reforms and territorial expansion. Henry was a mastermind of internal surveillance. He placed informants not only in the French courts, but among his own nobility, suspecting even his sons. What was family, after all, in the brutal calculus of royal survival? Espionage ensured that enemies could be countered before their intentions ever became declarations. In this way, diplomacy became preemptive defense, anticipating betrayal by reading the silences between words. Point 1 particularly chilling episode lies buried in the records of the Avignon papacy. In the 14th century, as rival factions within the Catholic Church vied for supremacy. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched not only to forge alliances, but to undermine them. Letters were intercepted, rewritten, and resealed. Messengers were detained or quietly vanished. Poisoned ink, false seals, and double agents blurred the line between communication and sabotage. Here, the sacred and the secular conspired in equal measure. Papal diplomacy, despite its holy appearance, was often a chessboard soaked in intrigue. That it was not uncommon for monarchs to employ cryptographers, specialists who encoded their missives in intricate ciphers. These were not the sophisticated algorithms of modern espionage, but arcane systems. The rotation of alphabets, the use of astrological symbols, alchemical runes, or references to ancient texts. The more complex the cipher, the safer the information, or so they believed. But deciphering codes became a political weapon of its own. In a world where written language was a rare and powerful commodity, a single decoded letter could shift the balance of an entire war point. One of the most astonishing diplomatic triumphs of the late Middle Ages came not through marriage or code, but sheer psychological mastery. In 1475, Louis XI of France, nicknamed the Universal Spider for his cunning, met with Edward IV of England at Picquigny. Their nations had warred for decades. Yet, in one afternoon, Louis turned a potential battlefield into a negotiated peace. He lavished Edward with gifts, gold, and even a pension, essentially paying him to stay home. No swords were drawn. No lands were ceded. But England, for a time, stepped back from continental ambition. Louis had outmaneuvered his adversary with flattery, spectacle, and the illusion of friendship. But behind the lavish pageantry of Picquigny lay deeper games. Louis had spies embedded in Edward's court long before the meeting. He knew the pressures facing the English king: fragile finances, restless nobles, and a population weary of war. Diplomacy, for Louis, was not a hope for peace. It was a performance of dominance. And like all great performances, its success relied on what remained unseen: the concept of soft power, so often attributed to modern geopolitics, had already found deep roots in the medieval psyche. Cultural exchange, paintings, manuscripts, musical instruments, exotic animals, became diplomatic currency. A scribe trained in Constantinople might be sent to Paris not merely as a gift, but as a symbol. We are watching. We are learning. We are not primitive. This soft language of prestige and imitation was far more persuasive than overt threats. Consider the Almohad Caliphate's interactions with the Christian kingdoms of Spain. Amid the violent struggle of the Reconquista, diplomatic embassies still crossed lines. One such mission involved the gifting of ancient scientific manuscripts, texts on mathematics, astronomy, and medicine translated from Greek and Arabic. These were not idle gestures. They served as subtle reminders of superiority in knowledge and culture. You may have armies, the message whispered, but we hold the keys to lost wisdom. In the courts of Sicily under Roger II, a curious fusion unfolded. The Norman king embraced Arabic science, Greek philosophy, and Latin administration. His court became a beacon of cultural and diplomatic synthesis. Through calculated openness to other traditions, Roger shaped his realm into a diplomatic bridge, leveraging knowledge as power. Here, diplomacy was not only political, it was epistemological, a contest of who best understood the world and its order. Yet, even the most delicate diplomacy had its thresholds. When negotiations failed, the mask of civility slipped, and force re-emerged, not blindly, but with surgical intent. Consider the Anglo-French relations leading up to the 13th century invasion of Normandy. Years of diplomatic maneuvering had failed. Envoys were rebuffed. Treaties were questioned. At last, war returned, not as the first option, but as the final punctuation in a long paragraph of failed persuasion. Diplomacy was not weakness, it was preparation. A king who fought without trying to negotiate was seen as rash. But a king who negotiated and then fought appeared righteous. Thus, medieval diplomacy lived in the liminal space between words and weapons. It demanded a peculiar blend of idealism and cynicism, the belief that peace was possible, but only if one planned for betrayal. A diplomat might sip wine with a foreign monarch at dusk and write intelligence reports about him by dawn. Take, for instance, the mysterious case of Jean de Courrèges and Jacques Legris in 14th-century France, a case known for its legendary trial by combat. Beneath the public spectacle, it was a diplomatic crisis. The king's court, caught between accusations of assault and nobility, struggled to resolve the issue diplomatically. Legris, connected to powerful patrons, was protected. Courrèges, denied satisfaction through normal channels, demanded trial by combat. When diplomacy failed, the result was a legal and political firestorm, shaking the entire royal court. And yet, even here, diplomats worked in the background, trying to contain the scandal to avoid fracturing alliances. These moments remind us that medieval diplomacy was not just about states. It was about individuals, men and women who, despite the danger, became conduits of fragile peace. Some were saints, others were liars. Many were both. But all understood one truth. In a world of shifting loyalties, power belonged to those who knew what not to say to us. Oh, what legacy did these invisible architects of Europe leave behind? Their greatest triumph, perhaps, is that we remember so little of them. They succeeded by preventing wars that never happened, by turning enemies into in-laws, by ensuring that fragile truces held just long enough for a generation to grow up in peace. The map of modern Europe is not merely the result of conquests and treaties. It is the shadow of 1,000 diplomatic gestures, of hands shaken across banquet tables, of scrolls signed in trembling candlelight, of secrets passed between allies, who remained enemies in their hearts, that we look back now, through the lens of time, and see kings and empires. But beneath their thrones, buried in dust and parchment, lie the quiet signatures of those who shaped history in silence. They say history is written by the victors, but in the Middle Ages, it was shaped by those who never drew a sword. Behind every crowned head was an invisible network of minds working not for glory, but for control. These were the diplomats who could alter the fate of nations without shedding a single drop of blood. And though they have been erased from the monuments of kings, their decisions still ripple through our borders, our languages, our lives. If we've walked through marriage, espionage, and negotiation, it is now time to understand the final, and perhaps most overlooked, legacy of medieval diplomacy. The philosophical architecture of Europe itself. To study these forgotten diplomats is not merely to recount political strategies. It is to recognize how a continent torn by religious schisms, tribal feuds, and dynastic paranoia found, somehow, a long and winding road toward a coherent civilization. For behind every alliance forged and war averted was a concept deeper than convenience, order. The medieval diplomat, unlike the modern ambassador, was not a representative of policy. He was a guardian of stability in an age that teetered constantly toward chaos. In the wake of the fall of Rome, Europe fractured. With it came a vacuum of not only power but meaning. The diplomat emerged not just to mediate between kings, but to forge something larger, a sense of continuity. Through dynastic unions, legal treaties, and symbolic gestures, they stitched together a map that was not simply geographic, but conceptual, one that allowed wildly different peoples and customs to exist in a shared political grammar. Take the Concordat of Worms in 1122. It's a name buried deep in the history books, mentioned briefly in passing, if at all, but its consequences shaped Europe's balance of power for centuries. This treaty, between Pope Calixtus II and Emperor Henry V, resolved the investiture controversy, a theological political crisis over who had the authority to appoint bishops. The stakes were existential: God or king, church or crown. But the resolution was not war. It was compromise. It was diplomacy. The agreement was subtle, careful, and vague by design, crafted to allow both sides to save face. But this ambiguity was the triumph. In it lay the genius of medieval diplomacy. The recognition that stability did not come from domination, but from deliberately constructed uncertainty. The gray areas gave breathing room. And so, the medieval world continued, not perfectly, not peacefully, but without unraveling that we now see echoes of these strategies in today's global order. The very idea of nation-states respecting one another's sovereignty, even as they maneuver behind the scenes, is medieval in origin. The use of international marriages may have faded, but the mechanism remains: trade agreements, multilateral treaties, back-channel diplomacy. All are descendants of these ancestral strategies. And yet, what makes medieval diplomacy feel so haunting today is the intimacy of it. These were not bureaucratic exchanges between faceless institutions. They were deeply personal gambits. Family members bartered like chess pieces, lifelong oaths made in the span of a single evening, betrayals committed with a kiss on the cheek. Point one of the most profound examples lies in the story of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Married first to the King of France, then to the King of England, Eleanor was more than a queen. She was a geopolitical fulcrum. Through her marriages, her children, and her patronage, she helped shape the balance of power across Western Europe. Her influence was not military. It was dynastic, cultural, and diplomatic. She embodied a truth the Middle Ages understood well: that soft power, if wielded wisely, could outlast empires. And yet, even this soft power had its dangers. The Byzantine Empire, perhaps the most diplomatically sophisticated power of the medieval world, collapsed not because of barbarian invasions or outright war, but because its own complex network of shifting alliances became unsustainable. Its diplomats were masters of delay, flattery, and manipulation. But when the Latin West and Islamic East no longer trusted Constantinople's double dealings, the empire found itself isolated, brilliant, but brittle. Thus we arrive at the paradox. Diplomacy can preserve peace, but it can also rot trust. In medieval Europe, the two often existed in precarious harmony. The line between strategic alliance and cynical betrayal was paper-thin. The very tools that prevented war also made its eventual outbreak more catastrophic, because by the time swords were drawn, the lies had already spread like roots beneath the soil. But perhaps that was always the cost of civilization. For as much as the Middle Ages were defined by faith and force, they were also built upon conversations that were never recorded, gestures that went unnoticed, and compromises that came at great personal cost. The diplomat had no monuments, no battlefield glory, but he was the architect of survival. And what of the dark arts they practiced? The psychological manipulation, the coded messages, the secret allegiances? These were not acts of corruption, but of necessity. In a world where one bad harvest could unseat a king, stability required control of perception, of narrative, of possibility itself. The diplomat was, in this sense, an early master of what we now call realpolitik, a precursor not only to the statesman but to the strategist, the intelligence analyst, even the cultural theorist. There are ancient records, mostly forgotten, of treatises written on the ethics of negotiation, monks debating whether it was a sin to lie for peace or a virtue to deceive for the greater good. In cloisters and chancelleries, the medieval mind wrestled with the weight of peace bought through manipulation. These were not easy victories. They were burdened ones that in the end, medieval diplomacy was not an escape from violence. It was a shaping of it, a redirection, a delay, sometimes a prevention, and always a reminder that power wears many faces. Today, we live under the legacies these forgotten negotiators left behind. Borders that seem natural are, in truth, the echoes of ancient agreements. Alliances we take for granted were forged through marriages long forgotten. Even our modern concept of diplomacy owes more to these hidden figures than we may ever realize. So the next time you picture the medieval world, don't look only to the battlefield or the castle keep. Look instead to the figures in the background, the envoy disappearing into the mist, the royal marriage arranged with a whisper, the ciphered letter tucked into a satchel bound for Rome or Paris or Cairo. For it was they, not the kings alone, who truly shaped Europe, and their greatest weapon was knowing what to say and when to say nothing at all. Asterisk history was never just written in blood, but in silence, ink, and intent. If this glimpse into the hidden world moved you, stay curious. Like the video. Subscribe for more truths buried beneath the surface. There's far more they never told us.